What is art without the muse? Many of Western art's most famous works are depictions of women. But who were these women? Do they have their own stories to share with the world? Hello and welcome to ArtMuse, a podcast that aims to reshape the ways in which we interpret well-known works of art by paying dues to the women whose images have been immortalized, but whose names and stories have been wrongfully overlooked. While these women's faces are familiar to viewers around the world, their identities have been largely forgotten. Together, we will explore the important lives and legacy of the female muse and appreciate these works of art from a new perspective, through the eyes of the women whose image stares back at us. Is the muse in actuality just as, if not more, important than the artists themselves? And I'm your host, Grace Anna. Hi listeners, host Grace Anna here. Today I am thrilled to share a special episode from our ArtMuse ArtTalks series, in which I am joined by the acclaimed author Francine Prose, who wrote The Lives of the Muses, 9 Women and the Artists They Inspired, a groundbreaking collection of the life stories of 9 female muses, including Elizabeth Siddal and Gala Dali, whom we have full ArtMuse episodes on, as well as Hester Thrall, Alice Liddell, Lou Andreas Salome, Lee Miller, Chris Weston, Suzanne Farrell, and Yoko Ono. Throughout the course of the interview, I ask Francine Prose about what inspired her to write The Lives of the Muses. Which women's stories resonated with her the most? The integral role the muse plays in the creation of works of art, and the importance of sharing these women's stories and honoring their immense legacies. If you have not yet listened to ArtMuse's episodes on Elizabeth Siddal and Gala Dali, I encourage you to listen to them as accompanying episodes to this interview. You can find ArtMuse's episodes on Elizabeth Siddal and Gala Dali by searching for ArtMuse on all streaming platforms, as well as on our website, www.artmusepodcast.com. Francine Prose is a renowned American author and critic. She has published several nonfiction books, including The Lives of the Muses, as well as several novels, essays, and short stories. She has also contributed works to major publications such as the New York Times and the New Yorker. Her novel, Blue Angel, was a finalist for the National Book Award, and her novel A Changed Man won the Dayton Literary Peace Prize. Prose is also the former president of PEN American Center and holds the title of Distinguished Writer in Residence at Bard College, where she is currently a professor. With that, let's dive into my fascinating conversation with the author Francine Prose. Francine, thank you so much for being with me today. It is such an honor. I'm really excited to dive into your work. I've read and loved The Lives of the Muses. For our listeners today who haven't yet read your work, could you introduce us a little to your book and let us know about its mission?
Well, the book started really, I guess, around 2000 because I got one of the early fellowships to the Coleman Center at the New York Public Library. And I hadn't applied. I mean, I just got this letter saying you get to spend a year in the great research library. So I really had to think of a project quick it was like by September when it began. And I'd gotten just from a local library sale, a book called like 500 of the Greatest Letters Ever Written or something like that. And in it, there was a letter from Samuel Johnson to Hester Thrall, who was identified as his muse. And the letter was after she'd been married and her husband had died. And then the letter was a response to her announcement that she was going to be married to her children's Italian singing instructor. And Samuel Johnson, who had supposedly, in theory, had a purely platonic relationship with Hester Thrale, wrote her this scathing letter, breaking off all relations between the two of them, saying, if this is, you want to continue with this egomania's plan, blah, blah. And it became clear to me that their relationship had been much more complicated than the hostess guest connection that had always been portrayed as what was between them. So that was really where I began. And it was great. I mean, going back, I guess I'd read Johnson some in college, but going back to read his work again and to read her letters again, the New York Public Library was insanely helpful. I mean, it was unbelievable what they had, and also the joy of being in the Coleman Center, where you could just go upstairs and hand in these slips for books, and 2 hours later, someone would bring like a rolling cart to your study, and you could read. So there was all this material about the Hester Thrale, Samuel Johnson relationship, and how much really his desire to be interesting to her, really, or to, I mean, she was apparently a very lively conversationalist and an extremely intelligent woman and so forth. So his desire to charm her or be interesting to her or be an entertaining guest at her house, which he was for very long periods of time, helped him in his writing, the essays, or, finding this sort of tone, voice, way in which he wrote as his career progressed until, of course, their friendship or whatever it was ended.
Mm.
So that made me think about sort of the role of the so-called muse and the artist muse. And then a friend suggested, well, there were 9 muses. And it was hard, because there were many other choices I could have made. And honestly, in retrospect, I think there were some different choices than the ones I did make. But I thought, okay, nine stories. And then the first one, of course, besides Hester Thrale and Samuel Johnson that came to mind, was Lewis Carroll and Alice Liddell. And again, the library, I mean, they had in the Bird collection, the presentation copy of the photograph of Dodgson Carroll's photograph of Alice Liddell as the beggar child. I mean, this incredibly disturbing picture of this little girl with like one shoulder bare, holding out her little hand as a beggar child. And they had the copy which Lewis Carroll had made and framed and hand tinted to give to her. So, and it was in restoration for most of the time I was there. And then I think in maybe the last week or two, I was at the library, they brought it down, and we were all like, it was like some weirdo holy relic that was, and her story was interesting because, she outlived Lewis Carroll by so many years, and she went on to have a similar and even more peculiar relationship with John Ruskin, the great art critic, until he was asked to leave the house, or they were both asked to leave. I mean, again, in that particular case, and in every case, really, the question would arise, what really were these relationships about? I mean, what really happened? There's something automatically, I'd say, suspect about a grown man whose closest friends are little girls and a few little boys. And so, fortunately, there are all these volumes of letters from Lewis Carroll to Alice and to other girls, and from the other girls to him. And I concluded that he wasn't a pedophile in the way we normally think of what a pedophile is, but I guess you could say, I mean, wildly eccentric, of course, and what we would call now an arrested development case, because he was so attached to his own childhood and the joys of his own childhood, and he was able to he was a mathematician. He was able to rediscover it hanging out with these children. Mm. And in that case, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass are very directly acknowledged as having been written for Alice and her sister. I mean, there's a little poem, a preface at the beginning, in which he describes being with them by the shores of the river on a summer afternoon or something, and spinning out this tale that kept the girls interested and fascinated. So in that particular case, I mean, maybe as much or more than any of the others, the relationship and the fact of the muse as inspiration was very clear cut and clearly acknowledged. I mean, the other cases I think were less clear. And one of the stories that interested me most, I guess, was that of Lee Miller, who was the photographer who, in fact, they just did a movie. It's not good. I mean, and it's impossible. Also, I mean, it suffers from the problems that biopics suffer. I wonder what's going to happen when she goes and finds Hitler's bathtub, which in real life, Lee Miller was photographed taking a bath in Hitler's bathtub. But what interested me about her was that I mean, she was very beautiful. She grew up in Poughkeepsie. And she started out, I mean, she had a series of kind of strange, I mean, she was almost run over by a carriage or car or something on Fifth Avenue. And a stranger pulled her to safety. And the stranger turned out to be Condé Nast. So Condé Nast said, why don't you come to the Condé Nast office and be a model? So she started off as a fashion model and then went to Paris and became Muse, no Muse, man-raised subject, certainly. And many of his greatest photographs were of Lee Miller. But then what interested me most about her case was that she went from being a quote unquote muse to having this incredible, nervy, courageous career of her own. I mean, she became a war photographer and she photographed scenes from the Spanish Civil War. And then she was photographing the liberation of the Nazi concentration camps on contract for Vogue of all, I mean, that was the other thing. The library had, I mean, you could find copies of Vogue from the 1940s. Just made you want to burst into tears because, they were publishing like Eudora Welty. I mean, all these great, I mean, the level at which they estimated their female readership was so much higher than, now it's like 10 makeup tips or whatever, it was much more. Anyway, she photographed the liberation of the camps and the New York Times refused to run the pictures because they said, oh, no one's going to believe this. It's too, and Vogue, of all places, was the first place that the pictures were published.
Wow.
So she was the one, in some ways, she was the one of the 9 that I wrote about who I had the most admiration for, really, because among other things, she was the bravest. I mean, it took enormous courage for her to do what she did.
Yeah.
And, and then she wound up, again, what happens is she wound up on this farm. She married a surrealist artist, Roland Penrose, and wound up on a farm in the British countryside, mostly as a hostess. I mean, her family didn't know that she'd been a great photographer until after her death. They found these boxes of photographs in the attic. So, she's a heavy drinker, et cetera, et cetera. But, I mean, I guess all of these stories bound or connected by the fact that they were muses or whatever that even means. They were all stories about what could or did or didn't or was possible in women's lives. I mean, how that changed over the century. You look at poor Elizabeth Siddal, who was just a disaster. And then, even after death, Dante Gabriel Rossetti exhumes her body so he can retrieve the book of poetry that he tossed into her open grave in a fit of remorse when she died. Like,
unbelievable.
Really? Yeah, unbelievable. I know. That was one. Then, Lou Andreas Salome, who was drawn to these geniuses. I mean, Nietzsche and Freud and Rilke, and kind of drew them into her orbit. And I guess did inspire them. Certainly she was a devoted audience and probably increased Nietzsche and Rilke's level of torment. But, who knows whether that was necessary to be that tormented, for them to write out of that torment. But nevertheless, she was there. And then when Freud began his early lectures and his work, she was like a devoted disciple, came to all his lectures, went to Vienna, et cetera, et cetera. So she was important in the lives of all, at least all 3 of these men. And also I was trying to pick stories or lives that were as different one from the other. I mean, so for example, it was a choice, like, should I write about Lou Andreas Salome or Alma Mahler, who had a kind of similar history of, Mahler and Gropius and so forth. Then I thought, well, one of those will do. So I picked Lou Andreas Salome. and then took it up to, well, Yoko Ono, I guess is the last in the book, who, everything you write, I think, in my experience, everything you write, years go by and you have second thoughts about how you might have done it differently. I mean, at the time I wrote it, I was very down on Yoko Ono. I mean, for all sorts of reasons. And one of them was this, which I mentioned in the book. There's a film when they were living also in the British countryside and recording, I guess Imagine or something. And they were recording, and they had all these like great New Orleans musicians there, and they were doing How Do You Sleep, which is the kind of nasty song that Lennon wrote about Paul McCartney. And there's this first take, and it's fabulous. I mean, it really swings. It sounds like Dr. John's early. I mean, it's like, and then there's this moment where you see Yoko going up to John and whispering in his ear, and John says something like, "Oh, it swings too much," or it's too blah blah blah. And they do a second take, which is not nearly as good as the initial version. And I went like, "Oh, great, Yoko, Yoko just ruined the song." But as the years have gone by, and Yoko Ono's still producing, and still, I mean, I've gained more and more respect for her, and I think I would have written that chapter slightly differently or very differently than I did. And also, there were other situations in which I was sorry that I hadn't included. I mean, for example, I wish that although it had been done a lot, and I mean, Janet Malcolm had just published a great book about Gertrude Stein and Alice B. Toklas. I mean, it would have been interesting, just again, for variety and importance, to write about a same-sex muse. And then I also wondered, why I limited myself to women. I mean, I was thinking about Isak Dinesen and Dennis Finch Hatton, and how she would essentially write her stories to amuse him when he stopped by on his, imperialist flying expeditions to Africa. So there were I mean, I have no desire to write about 9 more, but there were other choices that I might have made.
Fascinating. I think you did a really great job at explaining your process. It sounds like the library in some way was your path as well, and seeing what resources they had and what inspiration you got. And I think you did a wonderful job at introducing some of the women you talk about. Firstly, our podcast also focuses on women. And of course, Muses absolutely can encompass different genders and sexes and different dynamics. I think women are largely the most overlooked, especially in the art world. And these muses and these models are overlooked. So I think narrowing down on women is important. And I think you did an immense job in your book at encompassing, like you said, women who inspired literature, psychology, dance, music, and all of these different art forms. And it's so interesting to read about, and different time periods. You go as contemporary as Yoko Ono, you go all the way back to the pre-Raphaelites, and kind of encompasses 100, 200 years of women. Actually, that is one of the questions I had for you, because I thought it was a very interesting point that you made in your book, going off of time periods. I thought it was very interesting how you said that these women not only inspired specific artists, but they came to define the values of the time periods in which they lived. And I thought that was a really, really interesting point that you made. We have an episode, for instance, on Kiki du Montparnasse, and she's a good example of someone that we've covered that really came to define Paris during the Roaring Twenties. But you encompassed a lot of different periods. And there's, of course, some crossover of characters, like John Ruskin was involved with Alice Liddell as well as Elizabeth Siddal. But yeah, I think it's a great variety. And so I think our listeners will enjoy reading these different stories that encompass all of these different people, art forms, places, time periods. So, and I'm sure it was very hard to pick 9 women when I have a list now of maybe 500 women that I eventually want to cover, because once you open up the wells, there are so many amazing stories and amazing women to one day share their stories. Do you want to talk about that aspect of these women also telling us about the values of their time and why these women were inspiring to the artists of that time, and what that tells us about the values of that time period and that society?
There's certain patterns of behavior or interactions between women and the culture they're living in that actually keep recurring through time. I mean, I was just watching the other night some documentary about these fashion illustrators in the 70s in New York. And they were hanging out with all these kind of Warhol it girls, Jane Forth and so on. And as I was watching it, I was thinking, oh, it's so similar to Kiki and Montparnasse and that. I mean, the idea of these like young, beautiful party girls, basically, who had a huge influence on the culture of the time by doing not much except being fun and pretty and going to parties. And yet their influence spread very widely because of that. So, but again, each of these women, I mean, Lee Miller could never have been Lee Miller in Samuel Johnson's time.
Yeah.
So the world changed. I mean, the opportunities for Yoko Ono could never have been Yoko Ono in Elizabeth Siddall's time. So fortunately, I mean, now of course we're heading back in the opposite direction, but the way in which a woman could think about her life and lead her life, thank God, changed some, let's say, over the century.
Yeah, I think that is a very, very good point.
We'll continue our story after a brief word from our advertisers. Welcome back, listeners. Now let's dive back in.
Did you find commonalities between these women, common threads that as you were researching and writing these stories, or did you find that their stories were quite different? Because I loved how you said they all loved and were loved by their artists, which is obviously a common thread and a great theme to tie them all together. But I'm just curious. I'm curious because I've actually had thoughts of observations as I've done my research on various different women. One observation I've discovered is many of the women had a very strong maternal presence and an absent paternal. Their fathers either died young or left them. I'm not sure why that is, why so many of the stories, maybe these women eventually are looking at these male artists as to fill some sort of void or as father figures. I don't know. But I found that to be an interesting common thread that I've come across. And in your book, in your collection of stories, I loved that so many of the women ended up writing memoirs or books later in their life that share their side of the stories. That was one common thread I observed, but I'm curious to hear if you found commonalities or were the stories very different to you?
Well, I think, I'm trying to think if this is true or not. I think it is true. I think every single one of them was actively resistant to social convention. I mean, even poor Lizzie Siddall, to live with Dante Gabriel Rossetti without the holy matrimony, whatever. I mean, every single one went against the prescriptions of their time for what a woman's life should be. I mean, include all the way up through Yoko Ono. I mean, every single one of them. And they were actively working against the constrictions that society around them was putting on them. I mean, Lee Miller for sure. I mean, who sends a woman into, I mean, in fact, she and Margaret Bourke White were both in the war zone. But in general, women were not allowed to or supposed to or encouraged to do many of the things that these women did. So, they were rebels in each and a different way, but all of them.
I have the quote somewhere here where your discussion of Yoko Ono, not only was she a woman, but she was an Asian woman in a time where there was a lot of not just gender prejudice, but racial prejudice against her. And I love this quote. You said, "Our culture put Yoko Ono in a place from which she has to scream twice as loudly as anyone else simply to be heard." And I thought that was a powerful way to put some of the challenges she faced and probably continues to face today. So yeah, certainly they were all trailblazers in their own way.
Yeah, no, she literally had to scream.
Yeah.
I mean, that was, yeah, no, it's funny. I mean, it's funny people's reaction to Yoko, including my own. I mean, a couple of years ago, I was watching that 5-hour Peter Jackson documentary about the Beatles. And even then, when, as I said, my ideas about Yoko had changed considerably from when I wrote about her, even then, I mean, she's there all the time. She's like sitting in the studio, she's like super present. And I said, like, why is she there even now, I said, like, why is she there all the time? And one of my sons, who is a musician and records a lot, saying, like, that's what it's like in the studio. People wandering in and out. Some people, the girlfriends are there. It doesn't, it's not like a big deal. But I had that same kind of, I don't know, slightly annoyed, let's just say, response to her presence, which, why shouldn't she be there? I mean, they had fallen madly in love. Let her be there. But it was some, like, I don't know, some strangely, and I don't think that that had anything in particular to do with her being Asian. I think that had something to do with her being, the new fifth Beatle, and later blamed, probably incorrectly, for the breakup of the Beatles.
Yeah. Yeah. And then what she went through with John's tragic death. I mean, she's really, she's such a strong, brave woman to have persevered through all of that.
Yeah, I remember when I was writing it, I went to some dinner party and I was sitting next to a guy who'd been in some, I don't know, some 80s, early 90s hair band. I can't remember which one. And he was saying, and the subject of Yoko came up, and he said, oh, yeah, that happens all the time. There's a woman who broke up our band, blah, 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 blah. Mm-hmm. So I think that's part of musician mythology, which just is, in Yoko's case, was just wrong.
Mm. Did you find an extra pressure to write about her, given that she, and I believe Suzanne Farrell, is still alive? But did that process feel different, writing about these two women who were still alive and could potentially read your chapters on them?
No. I mean, they weren't going to sue me. And it wasn't like I was saying anything that wasn't documented. Mm. And Suzanne Farrell, I mean, I had never seen her dance in person. So I sort of was writing from kind of ignorance. And I mean, it was great because I was learning a lot about the ballet, but I didn't really know that much. And then my editor, who was still alive at the time, Robert Jones, who had seen her many times, said, you really ought to watch more video of her dancing. And it changed everything, because once I saw her dance, it was like, oh my God, I get it. I get everything that happened. I mean, I get why she was so important to Balanchine. I mean, she could do things that nobody else could do.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting how their relationship in particular was one that you pointed out as being more of a co-collaboration than some of the others. I was hoping actually you could speak more to that. Because at ArtMuse, we tried to put forth the idea that these artist models and muses were co-collaborators on works of art, but obviously some maybe more directly than others. So yeah, if you could speak a little to their relationship and their co-collaboration.
Well, the fact that she could do things that other dancers couldn't do allowed him to choreograph things that he couldn't do for other dancers. I mean, it was basically as simple as that. I mean, her skill, her technical skill, expanded the possibility of what he was able to do. I mean, what dances he was able to design. But I was talking earlier about Lou Andreas Salome having enabled or increased the suffering of the men she was involved with. And recently I was just watching a documentary about the first American ballerina in the Bolshoi. And, it's not something we didn't know, but when you look at the amount of pain, injury, suffering involved in being a professional dancer. And then I was thinking about the Suzanne Farrell, and I was thinking, like, she kind of did, just by nature of their two different occupations, she kind of did Balanchine's suffering for him, because, he wasn't required to do the insane, difficult physical feats that were being asked of him.
That is really interesting. And I think you make a good point too. Not all of these women, not necessarily Suzanne Farrell, but I'm thinking of Gala Dali or Lou Andreas Salome, did cause pain. Not all of them were necessarily stand-up women in that sense. And I found the process of writing Gala Dali's story was quite difficult in that sense because she's a very complex person
Yeah.
and she did some horrible, horrible things. And at the same time, she was very admirable in all these other ways. But I do think it's interesting that discussion of causing pain, or maybe whether it's the artist or the muse who's taking on that pain. Yeah, that not all of these women were necessarily the best of people.
Well, Gala Dali was such a grifter, for starters. I mean, she really, to have, what was it, him sign like, I don't know, 40,000
Yeah.
blank lithograph sheets that she could then sell after his death and devalue his work. I mean, my parents had a Dali litho, which they got for like nothing, and it was, I mean, then I thought, oh, right. When I started writing the book, I thought, yeah, mom and dad's Dali might very well have been one of the ones that Gala had put Salvador sign without having anything on it.
Yeah, absolutely. It still affects the market today. And
Yeah.
she had gambling addiction. She was dating very
And
young men, all throughout their
well,
marriage. There were
well, they both were. I mean, in a way, all these people were in their own often twisted ways. So again, admirable. I mean, he was, whatever, what did he have? Like a leopard or an ocelot? I can't remember. He was like walking on Fifth Avenue with when they lived at the pier. I mean, that devotion, and this was the 50s when behavioral standards were so narrow, and he was like, whatever, he would just do what he wanted. And the desire, in fact, of a number of them, the characters in the book, to be outrageous when the entire world was saying, you can't, you have to lead your life within some basically narrow confines. And they were like, no, I'm going to just be as wild as I can possibly want.
yeah, I'm pushing back against those societal
Yeah.
boundaries in that way.
We'll continue our story after a brief word from our advertisers. Welcome back, listeners. Now let's dive back in.
I wanted to talk a bit more about Alice Little because I do think she presents an interesting example in age difference. I mean, she was 10 when Lewis Carroll wrote, and he was 31 when he wrote Alice in Wonderland. And I guess it just made me think about, and I don't necessarily know my opinion or the answer yet, but it made me think about the idea of consent. Should being a muse be consensual or not? I mean obviously people are inspired by people who have already passed, so they can't give consent, but it made me think about the idea of consent and inspiration and the idea of consent and being a muse. And I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, or that chapter really got me thinking, because I think you do a good job at expressing the complexities of their relationship, but it just made me think, she was a child, so how does consent
She
play
was,
into
she
this?
was a child, but again, reading this volume of letters from other children or former children to Lewis Carroll, they all said, this was the happiest time of my life. This was the greatest. I mean, they felt, that horrible modern word seen by him. And I don't think if they'd been sexually molested, he would have gotten this pure outpouring of love and support. I mean, I just don't think even during the repressed Victorian era, it would have been like that. But I don't think women want to grow up to be someone's muse. I mean, it's not like a career plan. I think it sort of happens, and it happened to these women. But I don't think in any case it would have been their first choice for what they would do with their lives. It just worked out that way. And again, thank goodness for people like Lee Miller or Yoko Ono, who, because of circumstance or because of whatever, were forced to go beyond that particular role. I mean, the sad thing about Lee Miller's life was that she wound up in exactly the same place, only worse, that a more ordinary woman would have wound up if she just like married and had a kid and, lived on the farm. But not Yoko, not for sure.
Yeah, it is interesting to see some of these women's arcs of their life. I've found too that sadly, a lot of them, most of them die in obscurity or poverty or, kind of going backwards in a sense. And a lot of that too, I guess to your point about the different points of history, a lot of that did have to do with the restraints. I mean, of course, they pushed against the
Right.
societal boundaries, but at the end, they also fell victim to them. There was only so much
Right.
they could push. So, yeah, these stories are filled with amazing things and tragic things in that sense. Is there any of the women we haven't really dove deeper into yet?
Oh, Karis Weston, I don't know why. I mean, I think I think if I had one that I would later decide I was less interested in than the others, it would have been mainly because over time I've grown less and less interested in Edward Weston's work.
Mm,
So, it just seems so formal and I realized that it had a lot of influence on future photographers. I mean, I don't think there'd be a Mapplethorpe if there hadn't been a Weston, et cetera, et cetera. But she really, she was just a standard bearer for certain artists and a model. I mean, in that, and it's the shortest chapter in the book,
mm,
I think, for a good reason. So I think maybe I would have left her out and put somebody else in. But
mm.
again, you know, it just seemed interesting to put that.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I found her writing to be an interesting aspect of her story, and
Yeah.
that she did a lot of his writing on his behalf and then later went on to publish her own memoirs and
Yeah.
autobiographies. It's interesting, too, to your point of having maybe now a different opinion on the artist, but did researching the Muses change your opinion on any of these artists or philosophers?
Well, no, but I never was a big fan of Dante Gabriel Rossetti's art
Mm,
or poetry or whatever. And I became even less of a fan.
yeah.
But one of the things I found, and again, I guess I did quite a long book tour for this book. I mean, I was all over the place. And I was sort of shocked. I mean, I remember very clearly giving a talk at the Art Institute of Chicago, where there is one kind of well known Dante Gabriel Rossetti painting. And I was talking about how awfully he treated Lizzie Siddall. And there was so much pushback from the audience who had grown up looking at this painting and thought it was a great painting. And who was who was I to say that it wasn't a great painting, blah, blah. So I think what I did learn is how the various artists they were involved with or how they themselves were viewed or not viewed at the moment the book came out. I mean, there
Mm,
was you know, Yoko Ono, people were quite upset that I criticized Yoko. She has passionate fans. But, I'd just been to this really upsetting Yoko Ono show, and I kind of couldn't get it out of my mind. I can't remember if that's in the book, The Transparent Labyrinth, because there was a show at, I think it was a Japan House of Yoko Ono's work, and everything in it seemed, I mean, not exactly sadistic, but not exactly. I mean, there was this gigantic maze, labyrinth, made out of clear plastic, so that you walked in and you just couldn't orient yourself. And apparently, so many people were like bashing their faces into the walls trying to get out of the maze that they hired this special guard to stand there and talk you through it, this way, sweetheart, that way, this way. So, and then there was another, she did a recording of somebody coughing, just someone coughing, like coughing. And all I could think of, and it was like every 30 seconds, the recording would cough. And all I could think of again was the museum guard who was standing there listening to someone cough every 30 seconds for 8 hours a day, and could she not have foreseen that this was a possibility so I don't, it seemed to me that there was a kind of lack of, I don't know what to say. Well, it's the screaming too. I mean, a kind of lack of concern. I mean, not that artists are supposed to please their public, but on the other hand, there just seemed to be a lack of feeling for anyone who might visit the show or et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, her work definitely feels provocative in that sense. I am an admirer
Yeah.
of Yoko Ono, but I've found it very hard to actually enjoy her artworks and her, especially her singing. Her singing is really, really hard to sit through and listen to. So I completely understand in that sense. We haven't done an episode on Lee Miller yet, but Kiki de Montparnasse was also a muse to Man Ray. And it kind of changed my personal opinion on Man Ray as well. I think I found in their dynamic that he ultimately really struggled with being with a successful woman who, at that point she was a performer and a painter and this socialite and beloved by this community. And I think that kind of had them bump heads towards the end. And it
Right.
sort of seems like Lee Miller moved on from him for similar reasons as well, that maybe he wasn't giving her the recognition, or he was kind of keeping her small when she knew she was a talented photographer and had these greater ambitions. So that was definitely an artist that you just have a more complex view of. And again, it was
Yeah.
a different time, but yeah, he was one that my perspective changed a bit.
Well, he also taught, I don't, it's unclear whether she would have become a photographer without Man Ray. I mean, he taught her how to function in the darkroom
Yeah.
and how to arrange photographs. So, because until then, she'd always been on the other side of the camera. And suddenly with him, she was learning what it was like to take pictures. So you could say, yeah, he was a big attention hog. But on the other hand, would she have had the career that she subsequently had without him? Who knows? It would have been harder. I mean, she would have had to find someone to show her how to do it.
Yeah, I guess there is. Again, it's complex. There's this give and take of, I guess, with Elizabeth Siddal, similarly, Rossetti taught her a lot about making her own art. He gave her art supplies for her to make her own paintings, that studio space. So, yeah, in a sense, there is, especially with these women who are trying to then form their own careers or develop their own artistic practices, that they are, in a
Mm.
sense, indebted to the artists who originally, teach them how to do these
Yeah.
artistic practices.
Well, if they're lucky, they move beyond them. And if they're not lucky, like Elizabeth Siddal, they don't.
I feel like she tried in her own way. I mean, she had John Ruskin, who became sort of a patron of hers, but, ultimately it was very hard for her to push back the Ruskin, Rossetti, I mean, the controlling men in her life, and ultimately turned to laudanum and drugs as an
Well, the
escape.
opium addiction wasn't all that great, helpful.
No, no,
Yeah,
no. And
no, and
yeah,
it was available over the counter.
I
I mean,
was
you
going to
could
say,
anyone who wanted to. Yeah, it
yeah.
wasn't like such a big deal. I mean, some massive percentage of people, especially women, were doing laudanum all the time.
Yeah, it was very overly prescribed. I remember reading they
Mhm.
even would dip a little bit of it on baby bottles to stop babies from crying. So it was definitely well beyond a typical sort of
Yeah.
addiction. I mean, it was prescribed to her, it was over prescribed to people, and it was an incredibly addictive substance.
We'll continue our story after a brief word from our advertisers. Welcome back, listeners. Now let's dive back in.
What do you feel is the importance of sharing these stories? And how did learning about these women change the way you viewed, say, Man Ray's photographs or Balanchine's ballets? How did learning their stories change your perspective? And why is it important that people know their stories?
Well, I chose them out of all the hundreds of women you mentioned that could have been chosen because their lives seemed interesting to me. And because they were, I mean, I keep using this word admirable. It was just interesting to me to see what women had done at times, especially when it was really impossible for women to do much of anything, and how courageous and inventive and gifted they were to be able to, muse or no muse, or artist or no artist, to be able to forge their own lives for themselves at a time when that was much more difficult even than it is today. I mean, not that it's become, there's still problems, as we know, which are multiplying, but I won't say that it increased my respect for women in general, because, I mean, it couldn't be increased. It was so high to begin with. But it did make me realize that our modern belief that we don't have to live the lives that our parents or grandparents or grandmothers destined us for was not really so exclusively modern, that had always existed.
Yeah, and these women rebelled in the ways they could, and they build off each other, you know? Yeah, yeah. I also think it's just so many of these big names that Salvador Dali, Man Ray, Balanchine, everyone knows their names, but we don't all know the strong, brave women behind them, helping them
Sure.
create their work. And I think your book is really important in the sense that it shares their stories and focuses on them and their contributions to these famous artists across, like I said, across the mediums. I had never really considered, obviously, I've read Alice in Wonderland and grew up on the movies. I never really considered Alice the person. And it really is important to remember that a lot of these artworks and even Freud and modern psychology, that there were women behind a lot of these men that we know their names and stories, but the women's names and stories are not as universally shared. So it's really important that you shared these stories. And I thank you for doing that.
Thank you, Grace.
On that note, I did really love this quote in your book, and I was going to read it. I thought it really got to the heart of your project and our project here at ArtMuse about muses. You write of these 9 women, every one of them was extraordinary, either for who she was or what she did, or for the unique and heroic qualities with which her artist endowed her. Each was a product of her time, and each moved outside and beyond it, either through personal courage, originality, and determination, or through her mysterious role in the process that turns experience into art. The lives of the muses at once illuminate and deepen the mysteries of eros and creativity, as each muse redraws the border between the human and the divine, the mortal and the eternal. And I just thought that was a really beautiful quote. And again, really gets at the heart and importance of these women and the bravery that they showed and the contributions they make towards these works of art. And maybe there is a divine aspect. And I loved your discussion of that too, that art also has a divine aspect to it. Often artists don't actually know how and ideas came to them. But yet there are also these real people that do inspire. So I think the inclusion of both, and maybe they represent that divinity in their own ways as well. But I just thought that was such a beautiful passage and such a beautiful way to get at the heart of the idea of the muse.
Thank you. Thank you.
Before we end, I just wanted to ask if there was anything else you wanted to add in terms of the women we've discussed or the idea of muses in general.
No, I think we've kind of covered it. I think that's, I'm so glad that you got what I was trying to do in this book, and you really did. So thank you.
Oh, well, thank you so much for joining me today. For everyone listening, I am going to put the link to purchase The Lives of the Muses in the show notes of the episode, because I know our listeners will really enjoy your collection of stories. And again, it goes well beyond visual art. And most of the women in the book we have not yet discussed on ArtMuse. So it'll give a nice variety for our listeners to learn about other amazing women. So thank you so, so much for being here today.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening to this special episode from our ArtMuse ArtTalks series, in which I interview the author, Francine Prose. We have included a link to purchase The Lives of the Muses, 9 Women and the Artists They Inspired, in the show notes of this episode. I cannot recommend The Lives of the Muses enough, and know our listeners will find the life stories of these 9 women fascinating. We will be releasing more interviews this summer as part of our ArtMuse ArtTalks series as we prepare for Season 3. Season 3 of ArtMuse will return this October. In the meantime, we cannot wait to continue to share these fruitful conversations with you. Until next time, bye for now.